Singer's Famine, Affluence and Morality, Exposition and Appraisal, by Jason Zari. Hello, this is Jason Zari of the website Scholardarity.com, a website for research and publication in the humanities. At Scholardarity, we aim to be a community of scholars who share their ideas, discuss their research, and provide each other with support. In this Scholardarity audio article, I discuss what is perhaps the most famous article in ethics to be published in the 20th century. In his article, Famine, Affluence and Morality, Peter Singer gives a seemingly devastating critique of our ordinary ways of thinking about famine relief, charity, and morality in general. In spite of that, few people have accepted, or at any rate acted on, the conclusions he reaches. In light of these facts, one might say of Singer's arguments, as Hume said of Berkeley's arguments for immaterialism, that they admit of no answer and produce no conviction. While I do think that Singer's considerations show that people should do considerably more than most people actually do, they do not establish Singer's conclusions in their full strength or generality. So his arguments admit of a partial answer, and once properly qualified may produce some conviction. First, for the exposition. Singer argues that people who live in affluent countries must radically change their way of life and their conception of morality, so that they will become committed to helping those in need. He begins by asking us to consider cases of famine, such as the one in Bengal in 1971, where people were suffering severely, and neither governments nor individuals did anything near what would be required to relieve it. He sets the stage for his argument by putting forward two principles. First, suffering and death are bad, whether from hunger, deficient housing, or inadequate medical care. Second, if one is in a position to prevent a morally bad state of affairs, without sacrificing something of roughly equal moral importance, one should do so. From the first principle, it follows that whether one should help those who are suffering or dying doesn't depend on how close one is to them, unless that makes helping them more difficult, because their distance from one does nothing to lessen their suffering. From both principles together, it follows that one's obligation to help those who are suffering or dying doesn't go away if other people who are also in a position to help them aren't doing anything, because the presence of other people who do nothing is, in moral terms, no different from the absence of people who do something. Singer comments on this argument by adding that he could get by with a weaker version of the second principle, which would have the phrase, something of moral significance, in place of the phrase, something of roughly equal moral importance. He also gives a hypothetical example of the second principle in action. If one is in a position to save a child drowning in a pond, one should rescue the child, even though that means dirtying one's clothes, because that is not a morally significant cost, and the child's death would be an extremely morally bad state of affairs. Singer next considers a couple of objections. One is that if, for example, everyone were to donate what they should to famine relief, each person would only need to contribute a small amount, and thus there would be no reason for one to contribute more than a small amount. Singer responds that it's just not true that everyone donates what they should to famine relief, so this objection is irrelevant given the actual situation. Another is that, since not many people donate much to famine relief, those who do should keep giving until they reach the point where their well-being is roughly equal to that of the people they were trying to help. This would result in them donating much more than they need to, which means that things would be better if people didn't do quite as much as they should. Singer says that this would happen only if they didn't know how much others were donating, and if they all acted at the same time. If they do know, and don't all give at the same time, they may, and will, donate less than they otherwise would. Taking himself to have satisfactorily answered the past two objections, Singer regards the second principle as established, and says that if necessary he can still make his case using the weaker version. Singer thinks the foregoing has wide-ranging consequences for our moral thinking. Most people feel that they are perfectly within their rights to give whatever they choose to charity, whether it is nothing, a large amount, or something in between. According to Singer, this is wrong. The money that people of wealthy nations spend on luxury should instead be donated to charity, because the poor and the needy need it to survive. Donating one's money to help them isn't just good, it's obligatory. The distinction between what's just good and what's obligatory might still exist, but it doesn't apply to cases where affluent people can help the poor and needy. Singer concludes by saying that, contrary to some, Philosophers are competent to discuss famine relief, and moreover ought to discuss it. Just as importantly, philosophers should have the courage of their convictions and do what they know they ought to. It may not be an easy thing for one to do, but Singer believes that by doing so, one can begin to reconcile theory and practice. So, for the second part, the appraisal. I think we aren't in general required to do as much as Singer thinks we should do, for if we were, that would detract from our moral autonomy. I think that people are morally free to live their own lives and pursue their own interests, at least up to a point, and this entails that one is morally permitted to devote one's time, energy, and money to activities that don't directly have an impact on famine relief or similar worthy causes. It frequently happens that certain pursuits have beneficial consequences that may not be intended or could not be foreseen. Mathematics and physics are two related examples of disciplines from which we have obtained many practical goods, services, and technologies that in many cases were not among the goals of the intellectual activities that produced them. If we were not free to pursue our intellectual interests, when it is not clear what positive impact they might have, or whether they would have any positive impact at all, we would, paradoxically, probably be worse off than we actually are. How is this connected with Singer's arguments? It is relevant in this way. If people are obligated to do as much as they possibly can, to work full-time to relieve famine, they would have to give up many of their projects in order to do so. For those that do, we could end up missing out on their possibly unique contributions to human knowledge and any subsequent betterment of human welfare. This does not imply that people are morally permitted to pursue whatever interests they may have, especially when it has been shown that those interests have practically zero probability of bearing any socially beneficial fruits. It also doesn't imply that people are morally permitted not to contribute to famine relief or similar causes, nor even that they are only obligated to contribute a small amount. There's a big difference between being free to pursue one's interests and being free to waste one's time, energy, and money on luxuries. Things like, to borrow an example from Singer, buying stylish new clothes should not count as legitimate ways of pursuing one's interests. Aside from those who make those clothes, no one benefits from the money spent on them. Even if we suppose they did, such benefits pale in comparison to how much the poor and starving would benefit from one donating one's money to famine relief instead. However, I do think the above implies that we are morally permitted, to an extent, to choose what to do with our lives insofar as that is required for us to be free to pursue those of our interests which we know could have some chance of yielding socially beneficial fruits. Singer could raise two objections to my arguments. First, he could say that the benefits of contributing to famine relief are almost certain, while the benefits of pursuing such things as higher mathematics are not. Second, Singer could say that since it is unlikely that many people would be swayed by his arguments, not many people would end up abandoning their interests, so the negative impact of their doing so would be negligible. In reply to the first objection, I would admit that it is pretty clearly certain that donating to famine relief will have good consequences, surely, and it is pretty clearly not certain that pursuing higher mathematics will have good consequences. Nevertheless, pursuing things such as higher mathematics has unquestionably, on the whole, produced some very good consequences, and so it is pretty clearly certain that there is a non-negligible chance that you will produce some such consequence if you pursue higher mathematics. This naturally leads to a reply to the second objection. If you suddenly stop doing higher mathematics and devote yourself to working full-time to relieving famine, you could indeed save many lives that you would otherwise not have saved, but it may also be that because of that you failed to make a contribution that few, if any others, could have made to human knowledge, and hence nullified any potential practical benefits that might have eventually followed from that. The problem is that we just don't know. Note that I'm not saying that one is obligated to pursue one's interests, only that doing so is morally permissible. What I would say is that A, it is up to each of us to choose whether to pursue our interests and to an extent how much time, energy, and money to devote to them, and B, that people are, when in a frame of mind where they are both rational and honest with themselves, probably in a better position than others to judge what the consequences of such choices are likely to be. In conclusion, in spite of the above, once everything that I've said has been taken into account, It is still true that people should devote a good deal of their resources to famine relief and similar causes. In all likelihood, far more than most people in affluent nations, including me, either do contribute or wish to contribute. I would thus say that Singer's main argument is sound, provided that we accept the weaker version of Singer's second principle. In other words, that one should prevent morally bad states of affairs if one can do so without sacrificing something morally significant. It's just that I happen to think that having the moral autonomy to pursue one's interests is something morally significant, and from the foregoing it should be clear that this means one is morally free not to devote oneself to working full-time to prevent famine. However, I would question the stronger version of the second principle, which is that one should prevent morally bad states of affairs if one can do so without sacrificing something of roughly equal moral importance to the bad states of affairs one is trying to prevent. I question the second principle not because I think it is false, but because I think it is in many cases vague whether two or more states of affairs are of roughly equal moral importance. In the case I considered earlier, there was a trade-off between choosing to do something, namely donating to famine relief, which has a high probability of producing very beneficial results, and choosing to do something else, namely pursuing one's interest in such things as higher mathematics, which has a much lower but still non-negligible probability of producing very beneficial results. The problem is that it is by no means obvious how we can compare the beneficiality of these two results when we simply don't know what results pursuing one's interests might have, nor how beneficial they might turn out to be. For these reasons, I think that, while Singer's conclusions are correct, they aren't quite as correct as he thinks they are. References: Hume, David, An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, edited by Tom L. Beauchamp, Oxford University Press, 1999. Singer, Peter, Famine, Affluence and Morality, Ethical Theory and Anthology, edited by Russ Schaefer-Landau, Blackwell Publishing Ltd., 2007. Thank you, and continue the conversation at www.scholardarity.com. Bye.